So part of what I'm going to talk about is my trajectory from Whittier College through to being a partner at a law firm in downtown LA and how I got there. And when Sal asked me to talk about that, I thought that was really boring and the last thing you guys are going to hear about. But when I started thinking about that a little bit more and what that looked like, land and politics and social justice kind of came, it was clear that was a core part of my trajectory from Whittier College on. And so that's why I've asked Alina to come and talk a little bit after me about this amazing nonprofit organization that I helped found 12 or 14 or 15 years ago. Oh, wow. I'm getting old. So hopefully once I kind of tell you about the boring part about me, you'll have some more concrete information about what we're doing on the ground through LANLT. I don't work full-time with LANLT, obviously. I am one of the founders of the organization, was on the board for many years, left the org in terms of being on the board, and then came back when we were able to bring on someone as amazing as Alina, so I'm now the chair of the board. And also as I'm talking, the path will sound like it was really clear, that I was somehow sitting, as a freshman at Whittier, and I saw myself being at the law firm and or doing land policy. It really was not clear, and it still every day is not clear in terms of where I'm going. But one of the things I think being a Whittier scholar is you have to step back and figure out what the heck you're doing, and at least make it sound like it was done purposely. And so that's a skill that I used throughout my life, and I'll do it right now. And so I had to spend some time thinking about this trajectory, and it does sound clear, but as for students coming out of Whittier, just know that it's never going to be clear. And so I know I came here having no clue what I wanted to do. I had never heard the word sociology before. And so when they asked me, what major are you thinking of, I said, I have no clue. And they said, okay, sociology. And so I got shoved into this group in the beginning that Sal was leading. And so I didn't want to raise my hand and ask what sociology was, but so I figured it out about a year later. Because I was all over the map, I didn't know if I wanted to be a doctor or a secretary or a lawyer, because it was like the only 3 professions I thought were out there. And so but as I took more and more of Sal's classes and Les's classes, I started to see what I was really interested in, and the things that really interested me were this intersection between the environment, race, gender, and later on, land. I didn't really understand that connection to the actual land ownership until later on in my development at Whittier. But in the beginning, it's really exciting about. So with lots of help from Rich and Sal, I constructed a major around called Environmental and Social Policy, which was really Misty getting to pick what courses she wanted to take from Sal, Cheryl Swift, and Les. So that was really what that was about. But again, you just pitch it and make it sound like it works. So if you would have told me even 7 years ago that I would be a partner at Munger, and Olson, which is this sellout. I'm a sellout now. Big corporate law firm that represents people like Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett, I would never have believed you, and I still don't totally believe that. And so it's interesting that as you make decisions, you just have to kind of go with it and just stay true to what you're passionate about, and you'll figure, because there's going to be stuff out there that you didn't even know existed. And so anyway, I'll stop. I'll get off my soapbox on that. But just, I know especially with the seniors, you can sit here and think, oh my God, what am I going to do with this? And I didn't know. I was actually sitting in Les's social theory class my senior year, and he passed around a list of internship opportunities. And one of them was Environmental Defense Fund, which is a national nonprofit organization, had a environmental justice office. So an office in Los Angeles focused on environmental justice work. At that time, I didn't really know what environmental justice was. I didn't realize it was this intersection of exactly the things I was interested in, which were environment, race, and gender, and how the environment intersects with social justice. But it sounded like something interesting, and so I called them and asked if I could intern for them, and they said, no, we don't have internships. Last list was not good. But then I started, so I started reading more and more about environmental justice. Actually, in our library, back then we still actually looked up things. There wasn't Google, like I barely had email, and it wasn't that long ago. So I started reading more about environmental justice, and I hadn't heard that term before, but it turned out that 20 years before I was even looking into it, people had started a movement called environmental justice, and there was folks that were really focused on, especially in urban environments, why was it that the people of color and people who were poor were exposed to such conditions that were much worse than others in the community. And so the more I read about it, I convinced myself I needed to work at Environmental Defense Fund, even though they didn't have an internship. So I called daily and just bugged them. And I was like, I can scan your business cards. I can do anything. Like, I mean, just let me come in. So finally, and then I had the dean call. And then finally they said, fine. So this is halfway through my senior year. So I'm like, yay! And then I realized I had to take a bus, like 32 miles to LA. I was like, oh, glad I did this. So I took the bus 3 days a week, and I really just scanned business cards the first 3 days. And then just weaseled my way into everything that they were doing, and then finally made myself indispensable. So that's kind of where I really learned and was able to start seeing how to apply the social theory that I was learning at Whittier and the systems that I was learning in terms of politics, how that could actually be applied in real life. So I was at Environmental Defense Fund for about 2.5 years. So I interned there while I was here at Whittier, and then they created a position for me when I graduated. So I went straight into working so from I think I actually was full time, January my senior year on. I don't know if that's even allowed. And continued for about 2.5 years. And I was kind of really a community organizing position in the beginning, and then it shifted into kind of policy analysis. And while I was there, I was focused mostly on access to green space, and this idea of, we had done some early studies with the census data that had just come out in 2000, showing by council district in the city of LA that the 5 richest council districts had exponentially more park space than the 5 poorest, and they also had huge backyards and other things to be playing in. And so the kids that only had apartment halls also didn't have access or ability to walk to a park. And back then, no one was really talking about walking to the park and having access to small park spaces. The dynamic then was, if you want a park, create Central Park. It has to be a huge park. And so actually the policy in the city of LA at that time was that they wouldn't create a park unless it was at least 5 acres. And if you think of the city of LA and the poorest areas in the city of LA, there are very few 5-acre lots to fit into that social fabric. So that was something I was really interested in, and was doing policy work around an Environmental Defense Fund. And then the Staples Center fight started. And so if I'm starting to get too technical, someone in the back wave their hand and be like, so does anyone know, has anyone been to the Staples Center before? Mm-hmm. So has anyone parked at the parking lot in Staples Center? Yeah. So that parking lot used to be what was like really the last affordable housing in downtown LA. And I was not around when they decided when they entitled, and I was around, I was at Whittier, but I wasn't involved in this kind of work. But the city of LA demolished about 200 affordable housing units and didn't replace them, and gave that parcel to the folks, it's now AEG, that were developing Staples. So with no replacement housing for the affordable housing. No one was paying attention back then. Everyone was just excited about having a new sports center. And the social groups, social justice groups on the ground really weren't organized enough to kind of fight the initial Staples Center development. But after Staples was built, and that's kind of my generation where I come in, people started realizing, and started talking to the families that were living in that affordable housing. Actually, I think it was more than 200 units. We had identified 200 families that had lived in those units that were now homeless. And so there was a group of social justice organizations. One of the main ones was Strategic Actions for a Just Economy, who were working with those families and organizing the families and other tenants in the area to purchase that. I've done all of their leasing for, they're opening up at LAX a cafe. They have another cafe at City Hall that I did their leasing for that. So land starts being a part of even these smaller service organizations that you wouldn't even think have any tie to real estate do. So that's another piece of what I've been doing. So I've been talking way too long, so I'm going to hand it off, I think. But yeah, I've stayed at Munger because I have the freedom to do this work, and I also, at this point, have not figured out how I continue servicing those organizations for free without still being able to feed my children. So I work a lot of hours. Being at law firm, you work a lot of hours, but they're fulfilling. I for some reason enjoy doing what I do. So on a daily basis, I can be on, like today, I was on conference calls all day because I'm selling securities in cold storage facilities all over the world. So one of my companies, Americold, make sure that your turkeys stay frozen, and Ocean Spray's their other big client, so all of their cranberries stay cold as they're going around the world. So I do that, and then I get to turn around and work on an amazing park in Willowbrook, which is in South LA. And so I actually like that diversity, and I'm constantly applying the tools and the thinking around that big, huge corporations are using around their real estate, and applying it in the nonprofit context. For example, we being LANLT, now owns a whole bunch of parks, and there's ways to shield their liability and how they hold that land. And so some of the same concepts that I'm protecting big, huge, awful corporations, I'm now using those same concepts in the nonprofit world and kind of helping teach LANLT and the affordable housing folks and how to hold the land and do it in ways, in different ways. And I'm going to stop now because it's getting really technical. But we'll open up for questions, and I can go into more detail on any aspects of this. But I did want to hand over to Alina to talk a little bit about this amazing organization that, it's really odd to sit here and watch and just, I can't believe this is a real organization now. I mean, this is all in my head, and which is all fine and good, but you've got to have someone that actually has vision to implement it. And I realized early on that I was not the visionary to implement it. I had decided I wanted to be the supporter of nonprofits, and as a lawyer, you're not the front person. You're the person that's strategically in the background making it work, but you're not the visionary that's making all this stuff happen. So I sound like I'm really cool, but I'm not. I'm just the nerd in the background supporting all the cool work that everyone else is doing. And in Alina, we found a really cool, amazing visionary that can actually implement the crazy things that were in my head, and lots of people's heads. So anyway, without further ado, I introduce Alina, and also you should tell a little bit about your trajectory and how you got here.
I'm just going to stand up a little bit so I can see everybody. I'll try to also, so thank you, Misty. Every time I hear kind of your trajectory and story, it's just like, it's really inspiring. So, and I'm so glad that, having come to the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, I've had, I also went to a private liberal arts school. And it was a really formative time for me, and an important time in terms of really being able to kind of establish and set myself, in the trajectory of the career that I've had. In my career, I have my undergrad is actually biology pre-med, so I thought I was going to be a doctor, and then 6 months like interning in a hospital, I was like, yeah, this is not what I want to be doing. So, but I'm really glad I had a biology pre-med, degree, because it gives you, it is so important as you never really know when you're going to use the things you learn in college, even if you think, oh, well, in this profession, I'm never going to need to know about blank, but it's so, I just love the diversity of a liberal arts school. So anyway, good decision in coming to Whittier. So a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Alina Bokde. I'm the executive director of the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust. I have been I have a master's in planning, and have been doing some work around land planning. land use, real estate acquisition, conservation, community development work for, I am like really shocked to say, over 20 years.
She was 4 when she started.
Right. But it just, it is, it's, you know, and I still have a lot to learn. I mean, there are things that I know, but I learn every day, and I learn from Misty. A lot of important things about, you know, how important it is to continually, as you move through whatever career or work you do, that you stay grounded in the basic elements of what's important to you. So I'll try to cover in my presentation, try to cover a little bit of, you know, some of the elements you guys brought up and things you want to learn more about. But as Misty said, we're going to have time to be able to take some questions. So one of the things, just as a side note, the Walking to the Park report is actually on our website. So if you want to be able to read the report, feel free to go on the website. And I will start off the presentation by saying that Misty may not have known this, but even to this day in 2012, the establishment of the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust is truly revolutionary. Because although there are over 1,500 land trusts in the United States, there are truly a handful of urban land trusts in the country, and I would even say that there is not a land trust like the LA Neighborhood Land Trust anywhere in the country. In terms of the intersection between community organizing and land trust or land development work. Even when I talk to a couple other urban land trusts, they're looking at us going, wow, like you do that. So, and it's really because of the founding tenets of the organization, and it's still to this day very revolutionary. And I had a leader in the land trust, the national kind of land trust community, say to me last year, he's like, you're a fringe. You're on the fringe, but in fact, you should be the center of what it is we're talking about every day in the land trust community. But you're in the fringe because people don't know how to do this work. And so I just have to give Misty so many props about the kind of vision that, you know, that she brought, seriously. And it's important to hear that, because you know, not, it's even to this day, like, you know, it's very unique, the work of the organization. So
we're still figuring it out.
And I'm proud, yeah, exactly, and I'm proud to be there. So I will have these at the end if you want to grab any information about the little brochure of the land trust. They'll be right here. So what we have a number of projects. I'm going to highlight a couple of them and then talk a little bit more about, again, the approach and the philosophy of the land trust. So our mission is to create urban small parks and community gardens that are really become the center of community for you know, transforming neighborhoods. And so we utilize the tools and the philosophy of community organizing to engage community residents, organizations, to build a strong partnership to not only identify sites, but also develop, design, and steward these properties and these sites forever. So, so the work that we do is very rooted into the first step, which is organizing. So the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, we have talked to community elected officials, so elected officials who say, we want you to do Project A in this community, because it will help us get rid of a problem or something. And if we're out in the community and community members are like, that site has severe, you know, environmental contamination, there's, you know, other issues around community safety, where this site is actually not a good site, then we walk away. Because the first step is obviously, you know, we are here to really empower and develop community leaders around addressing the lack of parks and open space in Los Angeles. So the first step that we do is we organize, we involve, you know, the community and the partners in developing these sites. So I don't know how many of you know the landscape in Los Angeles, and when I say say Los Angeles, I mean both the city and the county, but the way that the city developed, and there's lots of, and county, there are lots of reasons related to this that I'm sure Sal covers, you know, in the class that are connected to a lot of principles of kind of, you know, sociology, but environmental justice and social justice and institutional racisms, that, you know, the way that it has manifested itself is that there are severe park inequities. And so we work in communities where, you know, you have 0.01% of, or 0.01 acres of open space per 1,000 people. So does anybody know what 0.01 acres like translates into? Like this space. So this living room is what people, most people today in 2012 living in a low income, you know, dense neighborhood in the city of Los Angeles or in unincorporated LA County, this is how much space they have for 1,000 people. So just imagine, you know, how severe the park inequity issue is. And so the solution that, you know, the Land Trust offers is to be able to begin to address that park inequity by, what we do is we leverage both private and public dollars to either buy or we lease land. So we lease land from public agencies. We also buy land. We actually bought a property last week from private individuals to protect that site. So we want to protect this property for the community in perpetuity. So we want to make sure that the investment, the space that is created that comes out of this community identified space and community design is actually protected long term, which is why the concept of a land trust is so critical, because a land trust is about controlling assets, it's about controlling land, and it's about controlling land on behalf of the community. And so, so that's the part of the acquire, is that we work with the community to secure these dollars. And then we have project managers on staff. They're landscape architects, landscape designers. So they work with the community organizers on our staff to actually design spaces. So what can happen with the other really, and why that's important, is that every space is different. So, you know, the one term that I'm not a big fan of is templates. I'm not a big fan of like creating templates, because I think that our communities are too diverse. They're too, and we should celebrate that diversity. And so space is utilized differently, even, you know, 6 blocks apart. So, and the needs are different. And so when we look at design and how community uses space, we really come with a blank slate. We use it as an education opportunity to say, here are things that, you know, we've done in other places, but we really let the community kind of lead the design. And then programming. So after the space is built, again, something that's also very unique to the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust model, which is not what you would find in many other land trusts, is that we believe that these spaces have to be programmed. So they are thriving spaces where community members decide anything, you know, they decide programming from Zumba, which, you know, I know is a Zumba craze these days, and I tried to do Zumba for like 2 minutes, and I thought I was going to pass out. I was like, I am strong, and I can do this, and then I was like, okay, I'm going to see you guys later. So, to doing education programs on how to garden. We have a number of community gardens that we own or lease within the city and the county, and then there's all kinds of programming. So what we do is we also we partner with other nonprofit organizations where they can actually offer programs at the site. So we partner with a clinic, for example, that offers where the park is next to a high school. We have lots of high school kids that come to the park after school, and so the clinic was offering sex education classes at the park, and I'm like, yeah, go for it. So
their parents were not so excited about it.
Yeah, I know. But those are the opportunities, is that space is used, again, by the community for community needs, and programming can change year to year. And then finally, managing, I talk about it as stewardship, and so we are really committed to creating stewards. So not just stewards around the land, but creating, so we are organizing, our community organizing model is really around creating leadership. And so it's not about, like, even when we're doing classes on, for our gardens on composting, like, we don't have, we may have someone, a master gardener, come in, but we, as much as we can, someone from within the community is also up there presenting, talking about, the way you compost. So we build, community members are leading the way to doing events, or we also do, train the trainer, where community members are training. So as much as we can, and we are committed to developing leadership skills, so that in fact, again, these are not spaces that the Land Trust is managing, but it's the community with support from the Land Trust.
Can I interject real quickly for the next slide?
Sure.
So it's so easy to think of this as just parks and having recreation space and then the connections to diabetes and health. I mean, all that's so important, but also these become places where people learn leadership skills that they apply to other problems in the community. So there are huge social justice issues in these communities, and once you learn how to advocate for yourself and speak with elected officials and deal with the police force and the senior lead officers on one issue just around this park, suddenly you're confident in addressing other issues in your community. So this is very much grounded in a broader way of slowly transforming a community and their control over their neighborhood through this one little spot or place in the middle of it. So, sorry.
No. And in fact, we'll take questions. And I'm going to wrap this up in the next 5 minutes because I think it's more important that we respond to your questions. But one of the important things is that, as I heard from all of you about the things that you want to learn more about or you care about, whether it's urban agriculture or planning or urban land issues or political landscapes or food systems, it's all very tied to land and who owns the land, who manages the land, who makes decisions about the land. And many times the communities we work in, Misty's example about Staples is a great example of like, wow, this huge development came in that impacted what happened on this piece of property, and like nobody knew about it. And one of the biggest things is around the leadership development is also about building capacity to engage in political landscapes. It's about building capacity to become aware that, in fact, there's a reason why, like, I'm eating, fast food in my neighborhood because that's the only thing that is available, and I don't know actually even what a carrot looks like. So we work with many high school students who have absolutely no idea where food comes from. But that isn't because, they don't want to know. It's because the way that land use decisions have been made, the processes, unless you become aware and you become trained, it's very difficult to participate in these processes. But land, and the big reason I'm involved in a lot of this work is that it's such a critical, it gives you power. It's a way of creating power around all of these issues. So
if you have read Marx and social theory, see, we're still arguing the same crap.
Exactly.
This 20 years later.
So these are just, pictures. It's always fun to see pictures. I'm up there in the front there talking about some park. This park is just, it brings me to tears every time we talk about it. We're going to break ground on it this fall, but it's called the Faith and Hope Park, and the history, just to talk about like the power of land as a healing space. This property has been, for a number of years, was next to an alley. This is in Willowbrook, which is south of Watts, and the alley is called Death Alley. Everyone just called it Death Alley. Many people from the community died on this alley. The local pastor's own brother was shot and killed. They would dump the bodies onto this property. This property had been abandoned for years because of both the death and also lots of other behavior happening on the site. But yet the supervisor, the elected official for the area, came to us and said, we want you to work with the community to see, you know, if we can create a green space, because severely, I mean, there is no parks in this community. And we spent the first 6 months just listening.
So this is these are groundbreaking projects because no one has figured this out. There is land in LA, but it's really hard to, and there's governmental agencies that control it, but they don't know how to open it up to the community. They're afraid of their own community, and so kind of there's so many layers of bureaucracy and walls that you have to break through just to use the existing space that's there. So I just don't want to, I want to make sure it's clear that there were so many legal barriers, and it took us, you know, 6 years to get to here before Alina even came on. So.
Yeah, and it's I mean, we're working on a project right now. The community's been fighting to move for 15 years. They actually, in fact, 10 years ago had a groundbreaking celebration, and they have to this day no park. And so the Land Trust a year ago was asked to come in, and we're very close, I think, to getting to a place where we can actually see it move forward. So these struggles of like a park. People say to me like, "Oh my God, your job must be so easy because like parks, like everybody loves parks." And I was like, God, I wish that was so true. But these are really there are complicated land use, you know, struggles, and many times in order to even move anything forward, you have to have 10 years of community struggle, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I joke, I just did a talk at my own firm to the other lawyers at my firm, but I was serious but joking, but I do multi-billion-dollar huge high-rise projects all over the world, and these are my toughest projects. By far. I mean, the logistics and the papering and getting the financing together for these parks is so much harder that when I go back to my real job, I'm like, oh, this is easy. Because everyone knows what they're doing. I know how to fight the red tape. I mean, it's unbelievable how this one little 1/3 of an acre park can take, you know, so long and so much legal work.
So we do it for lots of reasons. This is my last slide. I just skipped over, but these are, you know, these are the kids that are enjoying our park. So, you know, and it's I mean, it's so, for me, it's just personally so meaningful when I was walking down the street to Francis Avenue Garden.
We changed the name because of a donor.
Yeah, but now we call it MC, yeah. You know, and this kid runs out from this apartment complex, and he really wanted a little soccer field. There's a vacant lot next to the garden. And I'm like walking down the street, and he runs up to me out of this, you know, this little kid. He's been like 6, 7 years old, and he's like, "Are you the park lady?" And so you can build a reputation very quickly in the city about, you know, the kind of work you do. So, but you know, the other story that I'll share about just kind of the impact of this work that we can't. You know, we can measure things around how many parks get built and, you know, community leadership, but there's a park that we celebrated the opening of in December on 76th Street, also in South LA, 76th and Hoover, and there was, when the park was built, or before the park was built, there is a grandmother that's raising a boy who's in 2nd grade, and he was, you know, very unruly, and was already in 2nd grade was getting into trouble at school. Like, all his teachers were beginning to write him off, saying, you know, like he was confrontive to his teachers, and just, you know, very, very problematic. And his grandmother was incredibly stressed out about what was going to happen to this boy, to her grandson. And so the park was built. And we opened the park, and the grandmother was very involved in the design process, and so I had an opportunity to get to know her, and so, you know, seeing her grandson run around the park. And so since the park has been opened at the end of December, she told our community organizer, who shared the story with me about 2 weeks ago, that he is completely changed. So she made a deal with him because he loves the park so much. So she said, I will let you go to the park every day after school, but you have to study, you've got to do your homework, and you have to like be nice to your teachers, and you have to listen to me. And he's like, okay. And so he has completely changed 180% because I really believe it's like he can go and run and play and have fun and be with his friends, and so, you know, so I don't know what's going to happen to him. Of course, I have no idea what his life holds, but you know, that's the other piece that's so important, is that, you know, every person living in their neighborhood deserves to have a good education, deserves to have access to green space, deserves to have healthy food. You know, we deserve to have the things that help us become, you know, important, you know, contributing members of society. So anyway, so that, you know, it's those stories too that I think help kind of keep the many hours of meetings that we have to go through to get these projects done. But yeah, so with that, I will end my comments. So.
Just to, before we open up to questions, that you know, it's easy to take for granted, especially when you're in this beautiful kind of bucolic setting that's Whittier College. And I grew up in Santa Ana, which, although in a very poor community, we still had backyards and we still had you know, trees. There are areas in South LA and other in Koreatown and Pico Union that you can, and if you get out of your car and walk around in them, there are no trees. And there's even the strips on the sidewalk don't have grass in them or don't have trees in them. And so you don't realize until you're in these communities how distant they are from any type of nature and any kind of sense of freedom. And my kids are in LUSD and they have no grass, it's all blacktop. And there's very few trees and they're not allowed to run, they have a no run policy. During, I know I'm torturing my children having me in public school, but still, it's just crazy. I mean, they have, and so some of this, a lot of these societal issues all linked together in terms of, you know, if you're living in a blacktop community and eat at McDonald's every day, because that's the only thing in your community, it's really hard to, you know, get outside of that, right, and think outside that box. And we see these parents who are like, oh, how could you do that to your child? But they were raised in that too. And so and so it's amazing how we'll just cut a tiny little space in these communities. And it's, even though it's really tiny, or just grow one little bed and it change, and you're like, you must be exaggerating. This is not life transforming. It really is.
Thank you.
I kind of have two in one. So my first one is, how is your relationship with like LA County Park and Rec Department? And then also, and you're talking about like land trusts overall, and then you mentioned Brentwood Parks. Have you ever looked into, or like, what is your opinion on like the land trust for the veterans and that whole area in Westwood?
Well, the first part, yes, one of our best friends is the head of the LA County Parks and Rec Department. It's all relational. So we actually worked really well with the county, which is why we've had so much success in doing some of these parks in LA, and an unincorporated part of South LA. And so, but that's a new relationship that we've been developing just since Alina has been on board. And those are really important. And they're really important because there's a lot of money, which you may or might not know. There's all this talk, we all vote for the bonds to build park space, but that's just capital development. So it's, you build a park, but then what? And we have all these cash straps, counties and cities and everything else that really can't operate and maintain. They can't even mow the grass, let alone program with Zumba and like everything else, and have organizers on staff. So, and the O&M piece is what we call the operation and maintenance piece, and the programming piece is so important. And we also can't become a mini parks department. We have no interest in owning 150 parks. We're trying to create models so that people who are supposed to be creating parks will do it right. And so teaching the county how to do that, and teaching the cities and those, but that's a long-term vision and goal because they're very far from that. But those relationships are really important. Right now they're helping us with land acquisition. I think actually they're helping us with operation and maintenance dollars on some of our sites.
Yes.
So in terms of cost, it's a lot cheaper for them to just send one of their city workers along the path to mow and blow or whatever, rather than us, you know, hiring someone to go out there. So we've been trying to, on the economies of scale, really use those relationships. On the Veterans Park, I don't think we're doing anything out there. I'm sure in the parks movement world we've run across that, but we're not actively involved at all in there. Again, our mission is so tightly focused on areas of the city that have an inequity in park space that we really don't have the funds to go beyond that, and we're not even filling, like, we're not even in East LA yet, because, and even though that's a huge piece, because you know, there's only so much money out there.
I know one of the people that's involved in the West LA veterans, and I'm working on a project that involves veterans. And one answer to that is that the funding portfolio is really different for veteran projects, and that makes a big difference.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And the programming is different too.
Yeah, well, I was just last year with Dr. Bergerson, we did a seminar class on it, and we went down there and actually spoke to a bunch of people and got the public and private viewpoint on the park, so that's what I was wondering.
No, those are great models, and we're actually pushing on the federal piece. We're trying to do more and more USDA grants and kind of thinking with direct federal dollars, but unfortunately we don't have that same veterans tie all over the place. Although there is a park in Highland Park where a lot of homeless veterans stay, and so there's been some discussions in that community around how do we make this like a memorial for veterans. That's who's you know using the space right now to live on, and so there are a lot of synergies around that, but we're just not directly involved in all of that right now.
So I kind of have two questions. The first question is, so the majority of the work that you do, is that like conversion into green space, or like how would you describe that?
It depends. So like Estrella Park was already a park. So it's actually the Norwood kids, really in the 80s. They're like Norwood adults now. And so because there was no land trust back then, a community foundation, which gives out money, grants, held title to the property, but and then so of course the park fell in disrepair, and it was, you know, cats were just peeing it was gross. So we came along, and it was already green space, but it needed to be completely rebuilt, and the community around it had fallen apart, the community organizing around it had. So we had to go back in and reorganize the community. Obviously new neighbors lived there since when the park first started. So that's one example of where we were preserving existing space, but most of our work is the creation of new space.
Okay. And then I had another question. I know you mentioned like the Death Alley part, the park that was adjacent to Death Alley or something. Have you had any backlash like against the parks being like converted into like a community space versus like another group that was like using that space for something else, like in terms sort of like, I mean, we think of parks in a like super positive light, right? Like we're like, oh, parks are good, like yay, slides. But then other people might have been using that space for something different. So have you had like communities backlash against that space being converted into use for other people?
So, I mean, you know, if the space was already being used by the community for something else, like we wouldn't even go there. I mean, it's, so we've not had that situation because majority of the sites, as Misty said, I mean, the properties are usually abandoned lots. There's they're abandoned lots. They're actually places where a lot of illegal dumping happens, you know, prostitution, drugs. And so, there hasn't been a situation where there's been backlash. I think it's been more about questions more around, well, how are we going to address community safety issues? How are we going to, you know, what's going to go there? So it's more around that discussion. But I think that one of the things that we're looking at, and I think with the project at Fremont, it's a really good example of that, is to think about, and particularly I've been having these discussions more informally with like foster care and affordable housing developers, is how do we incorporate green space into projects, because even though affordable housing developers know how to develop land for affordable housing, what has happened is that they'll say, oh, we're going to build a park, but then they don't know, it's an expertise on how to build a park and how to build a garden.
And they say they'll build a park, but then when they get the tax credits, they realize they don't have money for it, so they don't. Yeah, or they don't,
or they put something that's pretty pathetic, or they build a park that nobody uses, and then they're like, why is no one coming to the park? And so, so I think so we also get called, it's amazing, like, how many times we get called saying, we built this park and no one's using it, can you tell us why? And, or plans, beautiful plans have been made and they haven't been vetted by the community. And so a lot of planning, this is the struggle we go through, a lot of planning happens without the community voice in it because it's hard. Community doesn't agree on everything.
It takes forever.
It takes a lot longer. You need resources, and you can't just like hold a meeting, 10 people will show up. You have to come up with, you know, different strategies. We do a lot of door knocking. So
another thing I'm looking in Chicago, they are remediating a lot of gas stations and oxidizing gas stations to deal with the contamination plumes.
Yep.
Now it's very expensive and there's some issues. Is that something the land trust has thought of, or is because there are so many gas stations now that are being abandoned because of the shift away from gasoline, and you know, also the transit is being expanded in LA, and it would certainly be a good use even for pocket parks of some of these areas, and they're all over, you know, south LA. I mean, is that something the trust is considered?
You know, don't even get me started on this issue. But so there's
go ahead. Well, we're just sorry.
No.
This is
I'll
my
answer after you.
because of my environmental background, and this is where we need to go. But as a nonprofit, we haven't been able to go there yet because of the funding and resources. But it's where we're going. I mean, so we have a huge project, which she can tell you more about at Del Amo, that is a contaminated site. So we're getting our board and our funders more and more comfortable with this idea of cleanup, and that you can remediate a site to be able to use it as a park. And we're going to have to, especially when we start talking about the river. All of the park space along the river is contaminated, and all of it has been, you know, have closed their files with DTSC for remediation. So
Department of Toxic Substance Control.
Right. So there is
State
a future there, and that's where I think that this work needs to go. But we're finally, I think, at a stage as an organization where we can take on that type of that level of liability, but also have a sophisticated enough staff to handle some of that, because it's a long-term process, and having the resources to deal with DTSC, the Department of Toxic Substance Control, and the Water Quality Control Board. You know, but I didn't mean to steal your thunder.
No, I'll just add two quick things. One is that the state of California does not make it friendly to do Brownfield's work. I mean, I grovel at the state of New York, because New York has very progressive Brownfield's work. Chicago, I mean, I go to these large cities and I'm like,
they're so far ahead of us.
What's wrong with us? So part of it is the regulatory systems in California don't allow us to even differentiate between, you know, projects that require a low level of remediation versus like those projects that are, you know, require years and years and years of remediation. You know, New York and Chicago actually are understanding that these spaces need to be utilized in the community, and Detroit. And so they're creating tiers of regulatory approaches to how, you know, to make sure that it's safe and healthy for, you know, for the community. So there are issues about the regulation that make it very prohibitive and very expensive for us to even deal with a site that would not even require that much. There's also, and within that, there's a huge dialogue that still needs to happen about what is safe for community use and what is not. And so engaging, you know, at a level of conversation around, you know, again, a very, very important environmental justice issue. And then thirdly, you know, around even with the regulation, I mean, there's just no leadership right now to do that, and so I think there's a huge opportunity for the Land Trust. You know, as Misty said, we're building our own capacity around that, but it has to be a very, you know, we have to have the dedicated resources to do that. But we are working on a 10-acre site that Shell Oil owns, and this is the park I was talking about. The community's been organizing for 15 years to bring a park at the site, which Shell has promised 20 years ago. And it's still not there. And so we've been working with Shell to make this a reality. So there's been a lot of remediation issues and liability issues, but there are so many projects that are fallow because there have been a number of things that we've not yet been able to kickstart. But on the upside, just to be positive, there is an effort with the National Park Service and the Environmental Protection Agency to start a program here in Los Angeles. It started all over the country, but they've been unable to get it going in LA, which says something about what's happening in LA, which is called the Groundworks Trust, and it's all about, in fact, looking at opportunities for addressing brownfield sites. So the Land Trust is one of the, whether we like it or not, we're actually one of the key participants in that discussion, and so hopefully we'll be able to get some stuff moving. So ask me in like 3 years, and hopefully I'll have
We're
some
about
revenues.
15 years behind Chicago. So like when we
And New York.
on everything.
I mean,
yeah. When we were doing the Walking to the Park report, we flew the people from Chicago Neighborspace out to talk to us because they had LNLT almost already in Chicago, and so we're modeled after, this organization's modeled after a lot of what they were doing in Chicago and in Baltimore and in New York, and so we're really far behind in LA.
In talking to community members, how do you feel like they cope and understand the fact that they don't have access to green space or that kind of food? Like what their interpretation of that is?
You know, community members know. Like I mean, it's kind of, you know, most of the, when we talk about the work of the Land Trust and who we are and the work that we do, like everyone's like, yeah, makes sense. And in fact, you know, we also work in communities where there's a huge number of immigrants. And, you know, and with immigrant communities, you know, they've had, you know, many other communities are much better, or the countries have more green space. So when they arrive, they're like, whoa, what happened? So I think there's also a certain consciousness that people come, you know, in some of the neighborhoods we're working in. So I think that the issue is that to a large extent it's about, you know, really giving, building the capacity and the tools of the community members to work collectively as a group to come up with solutions and then supporting them through those solutions. And so, so that's, I mean, that's really a big piece of it is that the Land Trust plays, I think, a connector role, a catalyst role for moving that forward. Because, you know, people are like, yeah, it's, I mean, I wish I could get access to healthy food, but what am I supposed to do about it? Like, people, you know, it's like, I mean, again, you know, there is a certain level, and you know, I don't want to minimize it because it is really important. It's, you know, it is important to have an awareness and an understanding of possible solutions, you know, because that's we do a lot of education as well in our work. So I think, you know, community members that we work with in the communities understand these disparities, but I think over the years, because of all the isms, you know, that exist, you know, being just disenfranchised and disempowered to do something about it. And so, so we're trying to change that. I mean, we can't, you know, change people 180, but we're trying to change that dynamic, so.
I was just curious about, I guess, how it's managed, how LA and LT is managed, and then like how many team members are part of it, and then also how is maintenance involved? Like, is the community a big part in helping to maintain, or do you guys have a team that manages once the parks are set up? I'm not sure, just curious.
So both. So the Land Trust, we have 18 employees. So I'm the executive director, and so I have our staff is broken up into, we have our landscape designers who work on designing the spaces. We have our community organizing team, which is out on the ground, working with the communities every day, and then we have our urban agriculture program staff, so the folks who work on the connecting to all of the food justice, food, community garden, surplus land, vacant land issues, and then I do all the real estate work with Misty, so. So that's kind of
the fundraising.
That's our team. So, oh yes, and we have a development director. How can I forget my development director?
And we have
so
an operations man.
Yeah, and an operations. So we have someone who works on fundraising with me, and then somebody who also helps with managing the office. There is someone on staff where a huge part of her job is to oversee the maintenance of all of our sites. So the way that we deal with maintenance, so as Misty said, a number of our sites, we actually have a relationship with the city or the county and the school district, where they will come and do some of the big stuff. So like if the drinking fountain breaks, you know, at some of the sites, the city or the county will come and fix the drinking fountain. So that, the bigger stuff, or so a lot of that can be handled. Some of the sites, we're responsible for it all. So we've got the full spectrum. So we work with a number of vendors. We work with, I mean, we've got people kind of on call that will come and fix things. We also, the other part of the maintenance is we work with community members to do cleanups. So one of the first pictures I showed you, there was a wall that was being painted. That was a cleanup for a future park that we're going to be building in South LA. So cleanups, we do, a number of our sites, we do a minimum of 6 cleanups a year. So the community comes out in full force, and it's not just the park or the garden, but it also is the neighborhood. So if you ever study alleys, there are alleys everywhere. It is crazy, but so alleys are also a big part of cleanups. And then we also have what's called the caretaker program. So we have community members who basically go to the park every day and are kind of the eyes and ears. I mean, we have community members who call us when stuff happens as well. So there's never a dull moment for the organizer.
I was wondering if you could share your insight on whether or not hustle has changed, the need to still hustle. Is it still as much? Is it less? Is it more?
So, I think. It's
and what are the things that you would say just to encourage us all to maybe consider hustle in the equation?
But 99% of life is showing up, and you know, I think that was the scariest thing for me going to law school, was how not smart everyone was around me. I just assumed that everyone in law school was going to be brilliant. And I was like, ugh. No, I don't want to be that smart, but just, you know, it's so much of it's just being at the right place in the right time, having the right parents, you know, who know the dean. But also, you know, so you can counteract some of that by just being on it, and because a lot of people around you aren't, and you got to be. And I think part of being at a small school with not as many resources as some other places, you got to be scrappy and kind of pull it all together, and that doesn't stop. And I still do that now. We still do that every day with NLT, and I've started other nonprofit organizations one other, and sit on other nonprofit boards, and a lot of it is just showing up and not giving up, and having a little bit of what I call the white man's disease, which just believing in yourself, like, you know, like that
entitlement. We also
entitlement. I call it white man's disease. Sorry, but yeah, like some of these little guys, like they have never been told no, so then they just, you know, go through. And then me, I look Swedish, but I'm Mexican, and I'm just like, oh, I'm gonna ask permission. And I learned really quickly that if you ask for permission, they're most likely gonna say no, and so you just have to like plow your way through. And so, when you're looking for jobs out there, I mean, and I actually, my sister-in-law is much younger than me, and she just graduated from UCLA with a women's studies major, and just seeing, I mean, like there's all these internships with no pay, and I know that's really frustrating, and so I've seen her hustle and just get out in front of it and hope and pray that turns into something. But so it's getting your foot in the door, but then also working your ass off once you get in the door, so other doors will open. And that happens for me every single day. Still, I mean, I've not made it in any way. As a partner in a law firm, I still have to bring in business. I still have to. So I find myself every day muscling my way through business. I think hustle's important, really important. So, yeah, and not accepting no for an answer, but also the listening part is important too. I mean, that's one of the things that I learned in this, is that I'm really good at thinking strategically, but then and not being the front person. Like I love that Alina is the front person running through this, because she's the visionary, and I like fixing and figuring out solutions in the background. And so learning your weaknesses and you're really knowing what those are and managing those will help you kind of bandage together a career and kind of find something that really fits right for you. So anyway, stop boring.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.